The collapse of the petrodollar could be coming sooner than we think. Happy Thursday, everyone, and welcome back to Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, Branko is joining me to follow up on discussions we had with Alex earlier in the week about the rapidly changing situation with the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency, as new deals with other global powers are being forged. So how are you today, Branko?
Good, thanks for having me on again.
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you about this because it's something that, even though we've already talked about a little bit this week with Alex, it's a conversation that's still continued on, and there's been more things happening around this as well, which you highlighted in the news today.
Yeah.
So it's good to sort of come back and dig a little bit deeper. So for anyone who missed out, can you just give us a bit of an overview first about what it means, this term petrodollar, and why the US dollar is really being propped up by that globally and has been for quite a while?
Yep. So quick background. When the US moved off the gold standard in 1971, in 1973, the petrodollar came into play, where basically if you wanted to purchase Saudi oil, you had to buy it in US dollars. And so that kind of gave a whole new level of liquidity into the US dollar market and a whole new access to new capital. Mm-hmm. So it's been kind of propping up the US dollar for some time now. And the news around this recently is that at Davos conference, Saudi Arabia, the finance minister recently said that they're open to new trade settlements and agreements and moving away potentially from the US dollar, including strengthening their relationship with China. So that's kind of the most recent news on that.
And that's huge. That's quite a large development, because I think a lot of the speculation around this is that we might be heading in that direction, but this is about as concrete as you're going to get, isn't it? That something is actually happening there.
Yeah, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes, which I'm sure we'll get into, as to why this is likely going to happen.
Right. So is the main reason, you mentioned China, is the main reason to do with China stepping in, and is there a direct correlation there with gold? Because I know we've seen some pretty significant buying numbers coming out of China with gold. What's the correlation there? What's the link?
Yeah, so effectively, bit of context. So between January 2022 and September 22, the largest gold buyer was Turkey, which bought about 31 tons during that time.
Right.
And though China hasn't been the most kind of upfront about their economic numbers, in November and December combined, their average amount of gold they bought was 31 tons. So over that 2-month period, right, they've averaged what the highest nation did in the 9 months prior. So they bought 62 total tons of gold in those 2 months. So we're seeing a pretty insane amount of gold buying from China. Now, why this links to Saudi Arabia is the development of a petro-yuan, like a China and Saudi gold-backed petrodollar, effectively, right, to replace the US dollar. So that's why, the reason as to why China would buy this much gold is very hard to pinpoint, other than this reason of wanting to develop the petro-yuan.
And certainly what you're saying that we're hearing out of that conference, the Davos stuff there, would align with that, because they're pretty much saying that fairly directly, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, this rumor has been circulating for a while. Then for the finance minister to come out and say that we want to strengthen our relationship with China and we're looking at other options, and for the past few months for China to be really ramping up their gold buying, I think it's pretty clear that we're going to have a situation where petro-yuan could come into play. Right. And to give more of a background on the effects of why the petrodollar was beneficial to America and how it's going to impact China, look no further than the ruble, right? The Russia's currency.
Yep.
So when the war happened, it obviously tanked, right, as we expected. But then Russia said, you know what? If you want to buy our gas, you have to pay in the ruble. And we saw the ruble massively rebound, to much higher than it was than the drop after the Ukraine war. So simply,
and it was quite spectacular, actually. And I think it really caught a lot of people by surprise, because in theory that shouldn't have happened, should it?
Correct. It doesn't make any sense, but that one simple rule change of, if you want to buy, our commodities, you need to have this currency. Well, look at the power of that. So of course China wants a piece of that, and if that goes away for the US petrodollar, then they could be in trouble.
Yep. So well, how does that affect us? Like, so what are the ripple effects of this? Because obviously, if we're effectively talking about a change in the way the US dollar is considered as a reserve currency, so it's not saying the US dollar disappears. Obviously, it's saying that there's actual competition, which there hasn't been for that whole 50 years, really. That's going to have impact. So, what do you think some of the ripple effects will be for everyone else, and probably particularly for us here?
Yeah, I think, in first world countries like Australia, we're obviously going to see a big increase in the volatility of our own currencies, which is something that we haven't really had in our history. So that's probably the clear thing. And then I would also say that, as a consequence of that volatility, you're going to see precious metals and gold and, safer assets probably rally as well.
And I suppose that does make sense, because the volatility will come in just because it's tumultuous. Like we haven't been through a period like this where you're not quite sure. So anytime that you have a change in world order of that sort of magnitude in something like the reserve currency, there's going to be unexpected consequences, isn't there?
Yeah, and also I will say that obviously there hasn't been a formal announcement of that they're going to have a petro-yuan type reserve currency. However, I think often these things, you can't just come out and say it as a plan. It has to be a very slow process. It has to build, and we're kind of seeing that continue to build. So as a consequence, I think we're going to see the volatility, kind of continue to build, as opposed to it just coming out one day and seeing a massive spike.
All of a sudden, it's a new system. Yeah, it's a more of a evolution into that system, and we're watching that unfold in real time. Absolutely. I just want to bring up a question, because we did have a question on the video the other day, actually, from Bill, who was writing on YouTube. He said, "I don't see how Australian investors can benefit from owning gold when the Australian dollar is expected to rise against the US dollar. So any potential capital gain on the physical ownership will be eroded as the Aussie climbs higher." Like, he sees it the other way. If the Aussie drops, sure, owning gold might be the ticket. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think that, that's kind of the smaller picture, is the Aussie dollar versus the US dollar. I think in an economy where we would see, a somewhat collapse of the previous reserve currency, gold's going to have, much bigger moves than just, 5 or 10%, like we could see potentially over a year's period in the Aussie US dollar. So I think it's important to keep that bigger picture in mind, especially with the chaos going on at the moment, that gold has a much higher potential than, just those two currencies kind of going up and down.
And you could probably even extend that argument against all fiat currencies, really, to say, if we are about to go into a period of time where there is uncertainty around the status of the US dollar, it won't really matter which fiat currency you're in. They're all going to be volatile. And the winner in that will be something that's outside of that system, which is where gold fits in. Potentially where crypto fits in as well. But I mean, that's a bit of a different conversation about things like Bitcoin and other alternatives to fiat. But certainly the bulk of countries are already doing it. If China's already doing it, they're doing it for that reason. And individuals will follow suit and say, well, I don't want that volatility, because we haven't experienced anything like that here, have we? Like, historically, we just don't have it, as you were saying before. So, what do you do in that situation? You go, I'm scared of the volatility. I'm not happy with the volatility we're experiencing. And you would move to something like gold.
Absolutely agree with that.
And I think some of these, you look at emerging markets, some of those countries are used to it. Like they have big, highly volatile moves in their currencies all the time. We're just not used to that at all.
Yeah, very small volatility here. Like you said, it's like 10% a year that the AUD might move, and in some of these emerging markets, that could be a day or a week, so yeah.
Yep. I think the final question I want to ask you today is about, and this is probably where it gets a little bit controversial, because I've had this conversation with a few people over the last week about, and actually longer than the last week, about the potential for the US dollar to really come unstuck here. And not no one, but a lot of people will push back very strongly and won't believe me on that and say, no, the US is going to do something about it. Like, you can't just say that, they've been so strong for so long. They're not going to just take this lying down. They're going to do something about it. So my question is, what's the motivation for Saudi Arabia here? Because clearly they're moving closer to China in this situation, and it feels like they're rejecting a little bit of that history and strength of that alliance with the US. So, what's your take on that?
Obviously, yeah, with these things, there are multiple influences, but I do think that the recent probably macroeconomic policy of the US and international and foreign policy is going to slowly drive away probably a lot of their allies. At the end of the day, profit talks, right? So it's obviously a lot more profitable for Saudi Arabia to potentially be involved in a petro-yuan than a petro-dollar, especially if China keeps buying gold and the one's a lot more stable. So, at the end of the day, I think we're going to see more of a trend towards the US alliances slowly kind of disintegrating, particularly as, like I said, their foreign policy and macro policy continues to be, probably not ideal.
So it's probably fair to say that I really like your line there, money talks. It's fair to say that, yes, in theory, people say, no, we will support the US dollar, but at the end of the day, they're going to move to the better form of money, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
we
had, for example, people, a lot of nations that were probably, needed like oil and gas and things. They were happy to, buy it from Russia, obviously, even if maybe that was against what they would say politically, but because it was
might be
that nation,
their policy. They might not be a Russian ally, but they're still your money talks line. The money talks. That if you can buy oil from Russia and you can't buy it from somewhere else, you're going to buy it from Russia.
Yeah, so I think we could see the same thing with Saudi Arabia moving away. Just at the end of the day, money talks. They want their best interests.
Yeah, right. Well, Branko, thanks for joining me today. I really find this an interesting topic, and your discussion has helped add more to my thinking around it. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks for having me on. Look forward to next time.
Thanks also to everyone for watching. Keep those questions and comments coming in on the social platforms because we also appreciate those. So that's us for this week. I'll be back next Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with the team. So until then, I hope everyone has a great weekend.